Gypsy Tales, Story number 7. The Snake Who Married a Princess. Once there lived an old man and an old woman. They had no children and therefore worried about what would become of them once they were too old to work. One afternoon, when the sky was gray and a cold wind was whistling in the trees, the old woman said, "Tomorrow you must leave here and go and find a son." The next morning the old man arose early. He picked up his axe, which was lying near the hearth, and departed. After having walked down a country lane for a few hours, he reached a wild forest he had never seen before. There he searched far and wide, somehow believing that he would miraculously stumble upon a young lad whom he would be able to bring back to his wife. But such luck was not to be. Not only did he fail in this task, but also in the more immediate one of finding some food for himself. After having roamed through the forest for 3 days, he was so overcome with hunger and fatigue that there was nothing else for him to do but return home. Just before he reached the edge of the forest, he noticed a little snake basking in the sun. He picked it up and placed it in his pocket and continued on his way. His wife was very upset when she learned that instead of finding a strapping young lad, her husband had come back with nothing better than a little snake. "What a fool of a husband I have," thought the old woman, a thought that was to recur many more times during the next few days, when she noticed that he was pampering the snake, daily feeding it with the cream of the milk and the choicest morsels of the meat. But what the old woman did not notice, merely because she was afraid of snakes, was that the reptile was growing at an amazing rate. One afternoon, about a month after the old man had brought the snake home, the snake raised its head, flitted its two-pronged tongue, and spoke to the old man. "The time has come for me to marry. Father, go to the king and ask him for his daughter." When the old man heard the snake's demand, he became terribly upset and threw his hands up in great despair. "Whoa!" he cried. "Whoa! How can I go to the king and make such an absurd demand? He'll have my head." But the snake replied, "Listen carefully, father. Go to the king and have no fear. Make the king an offer. Tell him that you'll give him whatever he may want." "But how can I do that?" asked the old man. "Do you know how poor I am? How can I offer him anything?" "I cannot explain," replied the snake, "but if you do as I ask, all will go well." The next day the old man walked slowly to the castle. With great hesitation and deep lines of worry clearly etched on his forehead, he advanced towards the throne where the king sat in great regal splendor. "Hail to thee, great king," said the old man, shaking with fear. "Peace be with you, peasant," replied the monarch. "What is it that you want?" "I've come here on behalf of my son. He wants to marry your daughter." "Marry my daughter?" asked the king, greatly astounded. Then he shook his fist in anger. "You're either making a bad joke, or you must be out of your mind, old man," he sputtered. "After all, you're a peasant, and I'm a king." "That matters not, great king," continued the old man. "If you'll permit your daughter to marry my son, I'll give you whatever you may want." Hearing that, the king was certain that he was dealing with a feeble-minded man. "Why not amuse him?" thought he. "I shall give him a task so impossible to perform that even he will realize the stupidity of his demand." "All right, then," said the king. "I'm prepared to give my daughter to your son in marriage, if you perform the following. Do you see that great forest?" And the king pointed to a vast forest that extended into the distant horizon. "By tomorrow morning you must fell all of the trees and turn the area into a level field. You must plow it, break up the earth, and sow it with millet. Then you must bring me a cake made of sweet milk. That is what you must do if my daughter is to marry your son." The old man took his leave and returned home. He was sad and afraid, for he knew all too well that the king had demanded impossible tasks of him. "Why are you crying, father?" asked the snake when he saw the old man sitting in his chair, holding his head in his hands and sobbing with uncontrollable passion. "Why shouldn't I cry?" asked the old peasant. "The king has asked me to perform impossible things." And he told the snake all that had passed. "Do not fear, father, and have a good night's rest," replied the snake. "I'll do exactly what the king demands." The next morning, when the peasant arose, he could not believe what he saw. The forest had disappeared. Instead, a lush field, ripe with the choicest cereal that swayed gently in the morning breeze, blanketed the area. On the table he found a delicious cake made of sweet milk. He hurried to the castle. "Great king," he said, "I've done as you have bid." "Indeed," replied the king, most impressed with this wondrous happening. "But listen to me. There is one more thing you must do before I permit this marriage between your son and my daughter. Build a gold bridge between your house and my palace. Let gold apple trees and gold pear trees grow on each side of this bridge. And finally, be sure that all of this is done by tomorrow morning." When the old man heard this command, he returned home and once again began to weep. But the snake was not in the least bit disturbed by the king's wishes. "Do not worry, father," he said. "Go to bed. It is easy for me to do what the king wishes." As soon as the sun had set, the snake began to work. By midnight, the task was completed. The next morning, when the peasant awoke, he was nearly blinded by the brilliant light that flooded his room. Looking out of his window, he saw a span of gold leading from his house to the palace. And for the third consecutive morning, the peasant went to the castle. This time, however, the king was waiting for him at the palace gates. There he clasped the peasant in a warm embrace. "Welcome, relative," he said. "You have done as I have asked. Go now and bring your son so that we may have the wedding." Joyously, the old peasant returned to his cottage and informed the snake of what had taken place. Within an hour, the old man and his snake were in the king's chambers. This time it was the king who was horrified and who trembled with fear when he saw the form of his prospective son-in-law. But before he could say a word, before he could renege on his promise, one of his most respected advisers spoke up. "Great king," said the counselor, "it would not be right for you to break your promise. The old peasant has done what you have asked him to do. Hence, must you not also do as you have promised?" Sadly, the king nodded in agreement. "Old man," he said at last, "here is the maiden. Take her to your home." Once in the cottage, the poor girl wept bitter tears thinking of her strange and terrible fate. Then the snake turned to her and said, "Don't be afraid of me. Actually, I'm not a snake at all." When she looked up, a handsome young prince, dressed in magnificent silks, embroidered with the finest gold filigree, stood before her. They embraced fondly, for the young girl had immediately fallen in love with him. The next day the king sent a messenger to the cottage to inquire about his daughter. It is impossible to describe his happiness upon hearing the good news. A great wedding feast was held, and the celebration, which was attended by rich and poor alike, lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. End of story number 7.